Okay, welcome back for another exciting chapter of The Witches. The narrator, now a mouse, has just successfully stolen a bottle of mouse maker formula from the Grand High Witch's room, and he's reunited with his grandmother. My grandmother carried me back onto her own bedroom and put me on the table. She set the precious bottle down beside me. "What time are those witches having supper in the dining room?" she asked. 8 o'clock, I answered. She looked at her watch. "It is now 6:10, she said. "We've got until 8 o'clock to work out our next move." Suddenly her eye fell upon Bruno. He was still in the banana bowl on the table. He had eaten 3 entire bananas and was now attacking a fourth. He had become immensely fat. "That's quite enough," my grandmother said, lifting him out of the bowl and putting him on the tabletop. "I think it's time we return this little fellow to the bosom of his family. Don't you agree, Bruno?" Bruno scowled at her. I've never seen a mouse scowl before, but he managed it. "My parents let me eat as much as I want," he said. "I'd rather be with them than you, anyway." "Of course you would," said my grandmother. "Do you know where your parents might be at this moment?" "Well, they were in the lounge not long ago," I said. "I saw them sitting there as we dashed up through on our way up here." "Right," said my grandmother. "Well, let's go and see if they're still there." "Do you want to come along?" she said, looking at me. "Oh, yes, please," I answered. "I shall put you both in my handbag," which is like a purse. She said, "Keep quiet and stay out of sight. If you must peep out now and again, don't show more than your little nose." Her handbag was a large, bulgy, black leather affair with a tortoiseshell clasp. She picked up Bruno and me and popped us into it. "I shall leave the clasp undone," she said, "but be sure to keep out of sight." I had no intention of keeping out of sight. I wanted to see everything. I seated myself in a little side pocket inside the bag, near the clasp, and from there I was able to poke out my head whenever I wanted to. "Hey!" Bruno called out. "Give me the rest of that banana I was eating." "Oh, all right," said my grandmother. "Anything to keep you quiet." She dropped the half-eaten banana into her bag and then slung the bag over her arm and marched out of the room and went thump, thump, thumping along the corridor with her walking stick. We went down in the lift to the ground floor and made our way through the reading room to the lounge. And there, sure enough, sat Mr. and Mrs. Jenkins in a couple of armchairs with low, round, glass-covered table between them. There were several other groups in there as well, but the Jenkinses were the only couple sitting alone. Mr. Jenkins was reading a newspaper. Mrs. Jenkins was knitting something large and mustard-colored. Only my nose and eyes were above the clasp of my mother's handbag, but I had a super view. I could see everything. My grandmother, dressed in black lace, went thumping across the floor of the lounge and halted in front of the Jenkins table. "Are you Mr. and Mrs. Jenkins?" she asked. Mr. Jenkins looked over the top of his newspaper and frowned. "Yes," he said, "I am Mr. Jenkins, and what can I do for you, madam?" "I'm afraid I have some rather alarming news about your son Bruno," she said. "What about Bruno?" Mr. Jenkins said. Mrs. Jenkins looked up, but went on knitting. "Oh, what's the little blighter been up to now?" Mr. Jenkins said. "Raiding the kitchen, I suppose." "It's a bit worse than that," my grandmother said. "Do you think we might go somewhere more private when I tell you about it?" "Private?" said Mr. Jenkins. "Why on earth would we have to be private?" "Well, this is not an easy thing for me to explain," my grandmother said. "I'd much rather we all went up to your room and sat down before I tell you any more." Mr. Jenkins lowered his paper. Mrs. Jenkins stopped knitting. "I don't want to go up to my room, madam," said Mr. Jenkins. "I'm quite comfortable here, thank you very much." He was a rather large, coarse man, and he wasn't used to being pushed around by anyone. "Kindly state your business, and then leave us alone," he added. He spoke as though he was addressing someone who was trying to sell him a vacuum cleaner. My poor grandmother, who had been doing her best to be kind to them, now began to bristle herself a bit. "We can't really talk here," she said. "There are too many people. This is a rather delicate and personal matter." "I'll talk where I darn well want to, madam," Mr. Jenkins said. "Come on now, out with it. If Bruno's broken a window or smashed your spectacles or something, I'll pay for the damage, but I am not budging out of this seat." One or two other groups in the room were beginning to stare at them now. Where is Bruno, anyway?" Mr. Jenkins said. "Tell him to come here. I want to see him." "He's here already," my grandmother said. "He's in my handbag." She patted the big floppy leather bag with her walking stick. "What the heck do you mean he's in your handbag?" said Mr. Jenkins. "Are you trying to be funny?" said Mrs. Jenkins. "Well, there's nothing funny about this," said my grandmother. "Your son has suffered a rather unfortunate mishap." "Well, he's always suffering mishaps," Mr. Jenkins said. "He suffers from overeating, and then he suffers from wind," means gas. "You should hear him after a good supper. Now, where is the little beggar?" "I've already told you," said my grandmother. "He's in my handbag. But I do think it might be better if we went somewhere private before you meet him in his present state." "This woman's mad," and mad means crazy. "Tell her to go away," said Mrs. Jenkins. "The plain fact is," my grandmother answered, "that your son Bruno has been rather drastically altered," means changed. "Altered? What the devil do you mean, altered?" shouted Mr. Jenkins. "Go away, you silly old woman," said Mrs. Jenkins. "I am trying to tell you, as gently as I possibly can, that Bruno really is in my handbag," my grandmother said. "My own grandson actually saw them doing it to him." "Saw who? Doing what?" "For heaven's sake, make sense," shouted Mr. Jenkins. He had a black mustache which jumped up and down whenever he shouted. "My grandson saw the witches turning your son into a mouse," my grandmother answered. "Call the manager, dear. Have this mad woman thrown out of the hotel," said Mrs. Jenkins. At this point, my grandmother's patience came to an end. She fished around in her handbag and found Bruno. She lifted him out and dumped him onto the glass table before his parents. Mrs. Jenkins took one look at the fat little brown mouse who was still chewing a bit of banana, and she let out a shriek that rattled the crystals on the chandelier. She sprang out of her chair yelling, "It's a mouse! Take it away! I can't stand the thing!" "It's Bruno," said my grandmother. "You nasty, cheeky old woman," shouted Mr. Jenkins. He started flapping his newspaper at Bruno, trying to sweep him off the table. My grandmother rushed forward and managed to grab Bruno before he got swept away. Mrs. Jenkins was still screaming her head off, and Mr. Jenkins was towering over us, shouting, "Get out of here! How dare you frighten my wife like that? Take your filthy mouth away this instant!" "Help!" screamed Mrs. Jenkins. Her face had gone the color of the underside of a fish. "Well, I did my best," said my grandmother. And with that, she turned and sailed out of the room, carrying Bruno back with her.